Hello and welcome to another episode of Big Talk College Sports with a Midwest perspective, blue collar and blue blood. I'm Dalton Shedler alongside my partner as always, Sam Sprunger. Sam, how are we doing today?
Fabulous. It's a good week thus far. I mean, granted, it's over, but yet it's just begun because we're starting with football tonight.
Football. How about it? I mean, we're halfway through the season now
Yeah,
for the Big Ten Conference. And what we've learned, look, we knew at this point that this past weekend was going to be one of the critical junctures of the season in terms of Oregon and Ohio State, and we would kind of have an idea who's in the inside lane to make it to that Big Ten championship game and maybe win the conference. We got that answer in hand. We've got questions about the back half. There's a lot to evaluate in this show. Let's go ahead with some of the answers we did learn. And let's go ahead and start off, Sam. As we mentioned, that game in Eugene, Oregon. The Oregon Ducks take on Ohio State. It's a top three battle at Autzen Stadium. Oregon prevails 32-31 with a win. Of course, this had a lot of theater down the stretch. Will Howard with 6 seconds left. The Ohio State quarterback takes a snap, scrambles, and you're yelling at your television by this point.
get
Throw it
down
away.
or get
Throw it
down.
away. Yeah, or get down. You still had one timeout. Do something, but don't use the entire clock. Unfortunately for Buckeye Nation, he did use the entire clock. Slid as time expired, and that was the end of the game. They could not get a field goal attempt there before the clock went out. But it was a dramatic game, and of course, what set that up was the penalty too in the previous play. And Dan Lanning admittedly later on in post admitted to throwing out a 12th player on the field, and that penalty caused the clock to run play before that, and that threw Ohio State for a loop. So there was all sorts of drama with this, but the Ducks get a big win, Sam.
Yeah, whatever your opinion of that play, that loophole that Lanning found, that plays nothing into the fact that Will Howard has to know, don't keep
Correct.
trying to extend the play. You have this finite amount of time. You've got to snap the ball. You've got to look. If it's not there, you either throw it away, or if you're running, you need to slide. The second, the split second your brain says I can get a couple more yards, slide, because that means you're running out of time. That way you have enough time to call timeout and maybe have a second left. uh yeah, that you got to know the situation, and mistakes happen, but that was a big one.
No, I completely agree. It's what I was happy about as a neutral observer, just a Big Ten football, we got a great game.
Oh
And that's
yeah.
what I
Yeah.
hoped for
Oh
going
yeah.
into it. There were questions in my mind. Look, Ohio State's severely talented. I still like Ohio State's roster better than Oregon's, but can Oregon punch up to that in that case? And they answered that they could. And look, again, I hate when we make conversations so simplistic, so I'm going to try to avoid doing it. But Dylan Gabriel, Oregon's quarterback, is better than Will Howard, Ohio
Yeah.
State's quarterback. I believe that. We believe that before the season. I mean,
Yeah.
Dylan Gabriel was a preseason Heisman favorite. And I think that made a big part of the difference, even though seemingly just about everything around those two team wise are Ohio State would have the upper hand in. But Dylan Gabriel showed up and played. He had been a little bit up and down at times throughout the early part of this Oregon season. I thought he's made a couple of questionable decisions, especially holding him to the high standard of being a preseason Heisman favorite. I mean, when you're looking at him through that prism, that's where I suppose you could be critical of his play early on, and it's been a little up and down. But he put it together in that one, and Oregon gets a huge statement win.
I honestly think I went into that game, and I did a little short last week, live short, talking about this game that a lot of people have criticized Oregon, thinking there was something wrong, and I
Hmm.
think they were just figuring it out. I
Hmm.
think come Oregon State, that's where Gabriel had figured it out, and now they at the time they're the number 3 team that everybody was expecting. So the fact that they hung around and even beat Ohio State, controversial or not, does not matter. They came out with the win. I think that puts them on a little bit higher of a level than what they originally were, because they finally have figured it out, I think.
I agree, and I think that's something that we've been sitting there saying is they have tools.
Right.
Let's see how it comes. And
Right.
finally, it felt like it really came together for that big win. And the other part that's interesting about what you said, Sam, is if you look back early in the season when everybody was sweating and concerned about Oregon, all these close escaping games like Boise State. Well, it turns out Boise
I
State's
was going to say, we can't even say Boise State's a bad game to where they only won by 3. They're going to be a playoff team more than likely.
At this point, look, I don't have a vote for the Heisman Trophy, but if I did, in middle October, Ashton Genty would be my
Yes.
Heisman Trophy winner. I
Yes.
mean, what the numbers he's doing are just silly. Like you couldn't do it on a video game. They're not video game numbers. It's ridiculous.
They're the freshman setting of the video game numbers.
I saw a stat the other. So he's already ran for like 1,000+ yards.
Yeah.
Right? He's played like essentially. If you don't count the second halves, he sat out. He's played like 3 games.
Yeah.
Like it's insane.
Those are Marshall Falk numbers at San Diego State.
Right.
You weren't old. You were. I don't even know that you were born, or if you were extremely young. Marshall Falk, for the first half of his last season at San Diego State, averaged over 330 yards.
That's insane.
It's insane.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I'm curious. Genty, 3,000's possible.
Yeah.
That's gonna be fun to watch in that specific case. But I saw a stat like 2 weeks ago. I have like a group chat now where we just send stupid Ashton Genty numbers to each other. That's a total
group,
normal sports thing. Yeah, right.
You put people together in a chain for that, huh?
Genty for Heisman fan club. Let's text about it. But I saw a
Thoughts?
stat that in carries that Genty had of 8+ defenders in the box, he's averaging 9 yards a carry.
Stupid numbers.
That's ridiculous.
So because you think about it, there's to the most there's 6 people probably blocking, which means it's 2 against 1, and he's still getting 9, almost a first down.
Just doesn't matter. So yeah, so that in part that was part of the propaganda of me infiltrating some Genty talk into the program, but also
I don't mind.
Also, it goes to show Oregon escaping that game doesn't look so bad.
No, it's not a bad win now. It's not
right.
oh my gosh, how did you struggle? Now, the Idaho win, that was more of a, oh my goodness, what happened there? But I think his first game of the season, Dylan Gabriel actually being in game situations, I think that's why there was, and Idaho maybe isn't as bad as what they have been in past. I don't know.
Other games from last week.
Yes.
We had number 23 Illinois hanging on for dear life against Purdue, 50-49. This one was all sorts of wacky. Purdue scores.
It was 24-3 at the half.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say that's exactly right. So Purdue scores 40 points in the second half. 4D. It's 43-43 at the end of regulation. Illinois gets the ball first in overtime. They score a touchdown and the extra point. So it's now 50-43. Purdue comes down. They score a touchdown. They decide, hey, what do we got to lose? Let's go for 2 here in the win.
We're being considered the worst team in the Big Ten, maybe even, or we are the worst team in the Big Ten, maybe the worst in Division I. Why don't we go for a big upset?
I was going to say the label that has been tossed around is that the worst Power 4. Yeah, it's Power 4 now. Power 4 team in the country.
I don't necessarily think I would argue with it.
Yeah. So, you know what? Let's go for the win. They do. They can't convert. Illinois hangs on. And what's interesting about this one to me, Sam, is we're looking at an Illinois team that's, 5-1?
Mm-hmm.
I believe. They only have the one loss.
Yes.
But they got a win against, number 19, Kansas.
Yep.
They had a win against Nebraska. Thank you. And that one was an overtime game. That one was 31-24. They lose to Penn State. They have this week coming up, which we'll talk about in a minute, a ranked Michigan team. In the following week, they have Oregon. Like, there's so much going on in that schedule. And then in the middle of it, here's Purdue to jump up and get you, because that's what Purdue is. Like, the Boilermakers.
Was it them overlooking Purdue? Is it possible that that's what they were doing?
Well,
they were up 24-3 at the half, and they're like, "Nah, let's cruise."
Well, and I kind of wonder that a little bit too, because if you're looking at 5 ranked teams within an 8-game stretch, and then Purdue's there on the schedule,
why not take that week off?
Yeah, and not that you ever intentionally decide that, but I think that's a little bit of what took place. Yeah,
I think you're right. Yeah,
but I do think it still stands to reason that Illinois escaping that game and keeping this season alive, where honestly, you're if they pick up a win this weekend against Michigan, we're starting to talk about the Illini in the playoff.
Correct.
Like that's what's on the line. That's also the beauty of the expanded playoff, where
Yep.
now instead of it affecting like 6 teams that are vying for those 4 spots, you could talk about 20 teams for
At
those
least
top
with
12 spots.
consideration.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
So
think one other team that really have benefited didn't even play this week, so that's why. But we'll talk about that later.
okay. I was gonna say keep that in the holster because I'll be
Oh yeah,
curious
it's
to
right
see who it
here.
is.
I'm gonna.
One of the other interesting games from last week was another overtime one out in LA. Penn
Yes.
State beats USC 33-30. Penn State gets a field goal in overtime to win it. But this one was really USC was in control in the first half. They were up 20-6, and then Penn State scores 24 in the second half, and Penn State survives another
hmm
game there.
Yeah, that was it shocked me. I was driving, so I had to listen to it, but I was listening to it, and they come back from the half and they hadn't said the score yet, and that's when I started getting to listen to it, and they said, Penn State's got to score, right out of the gate, and I'm like, wow, are they ahead by a little bit, or are they trailing by a score or whatever? And they say it's 20-6. I'm like, holy cow, really? Really? USC goes and struggles and loses to Minnesota, not taking anything away from the Gophers.
Uh-huh.
But then number 4 comes in and Penn State's struggling against USC.
Yep.
Shocked me. But then Penn State righted the ship and was able to pull it out in the end, and it was a good game. USC had the home advantage or whatever you want to call it, but they, the one thing that does shock me is they're 1-3 in the Big Ten. It just throws me for a loop to see USC with a losing record, that much of a losing record in the Big Ten conference.
Yeah, there's got to be some adjustments made by USC if it's
Yeah.
going to win at a high level in this conference moving forward. But I thought what was interesting about the Penn State game too is, look, there's been a lot of talk, and I don't know how much is based on the data sample we have. I don't know how much we can really rule in or rule out to this, but all the talk of teams that travel across 2 time zones in their records, and it's something like I look, I'm paraphrasing. Don't hold me to it. This is not exact, but it was like 1-10 before the weekend, and now it's like 2-11 or something, I think, or something like that.
Now, are we
Um,
talking teams that go east or go west, or just it doesn't matter
Either
if they
way, just if
change?
you move 2 time zones, like
Okay,
your record is like
it's
2 and
a
11.
dumpster fire.
It's something like that, and
If
I don't
those
know
two
how
wins
much
are
of it.
accurate, that would mean it would be Minnesota and Penn State that went
Yeah,
across those time zones to win.
yeah, and like I said, it's very possible that I'm working off of an outdated stat at this
Yeah,
point, so
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
why I'm being very careful.
Something in the
But
neighborhood of terrible.
yes,
Okay,
and I
fair.
don't know how much of it is just based on the matchups, and it's like, well, yeah, most of those teams were supposed to win or supposed to lose. But I'm curious if the travel is actually playing a pretty big factor in this, based on some of that sample. And in
Washington's
my
done it twice and lost both times.
yeah, in my other
Michigan
thought,
did it and lost to Washington. Like it lends that it's probably pretty accurate either way.
well, and the big thought I have then is because I thought football it wouldn't be as big of a factor. Like,
Right.
sure, maybe there's something to it, but what about when we get to basketball season?
Oh
Like,
yeah.
that's where I think it's really going to take a toll on some of these teams, and
Because
we
they're going
might
to be
see that
playing. Well,
become
the second game of a road trip might be okay comparatively because
mhm.
they've had enough time to adjust to it because they're going to stay in the East or stay in the West, and they'll have a couple more days to adjust. So it might be a little bit better. But I agree that first one is definitely going to be, especially if it's a Saturday. You're playing a game. Normally in the East, you're tipping off maybe at noon, maybe even 11 o'clock. That's 8 or 9 if you're from the West Coast.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point, and
Yeah.
I mean, look, in general, for even us like non-players, traveling sucks.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
it just sucks.
It
So
tires you out one way or another, and
yeah,
then hey, let's change the time on you too.
yeah. So I'm curious if there's anything to that. But with Penn State, what I found interesting is this was a game they typically I believe lose. Drew Aller throws 3 interceptions. They're on the road. They're down.
Mhm.
That's a game that I feel like they don't normally come back from, but they found a way to do it. And I thought that spoke a little bit to this character of this Penn State team because look, when we talk about the playoff expansion, I thought the first team that it would affect that came to my mind was Penn State
Yeah.
when it went from 4 teams to 12 teams because
Yep.
Penn State's always in the top 12, but
Yeah.
they're never in the top 4.
They're always
And
doing a New Year's Six, but they're not ever getting into the playoff.
right.
Yeah.
And now they can. And they sit at 6-0. They're a top 3 team in the country. Them surviving that game I thought was pretty big. And they were able to, I suppose, overcome their own wrongdoings of
Right.
all the turnovers.
Yeah. They played a pretty clean second half from my listening is they controlled it. They got back in the game and then they trailed by 3 going into the fourth, but they came back, took it and tied it up and were able to go to overtime. But it just like they played a really clean in those big games, and I use the air quotes there, the big games that they normally come up very lackluster in. They showed up. Now, don't get me wrong. We just talked about USC 1-2 at the time. Now 1-3 in the Big Ten. They're still USC. They've still got a really good offense. Their defense, it's questionable at best. But the same point, it's USC. You're in the Coliseum, so I mean it's the away crowd. Which coincidentally, did you see that USC allows people to pay $1,500 to run out with the team? And
That
the
was
Penn
an
State
epic
guy,
video. Epic video.
the guy from Penn State dresses all in Penn State's clothing and takes his GoPro out and runs out with USC.
That was I couldn't believe when I was watching it.
I can't believe they didn't have a restriction.
I I don't know what exactly. Look, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what you can do if you're the program, but doesn't it feel like have your money back and go sit over here? Like,
Yeah, we'll
I,
write you a check. Here you go. Go. You can't do this. Go.
right.
No, let him do
But
it.
he ran out and he was, I mean, the video, he was electric in it too. He's
Oh
like,
yeah.
come on, come on, throwing his hands up. That was something else.
But the point being on that I was trying to make there with Penn State, that's still a tough trip to make. Plus, they just went like you said across at least 2 time zones, so they were playing at a disadvantage because they were on the road and way different times than they were normally used to. But I think they're a little different this year. I really do.
Yep.
They've got Drew Aller's a little bit older, more experienced, and I think he's able to recover a little bit more from mistakes that he makes and maybe not letting it dwell and hang over him and just snowball into more. He's grown up. Dalton.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Yeah, I really am excited to see what they do the back stretch of the season.
Yeah.
A couple other games that were interesting for different reasons from last week in Big Ten football. Iowa. It's still getting hard to get used to 40 points next to Iowa's name.
You're like you did that wrong, right? They scored
Right.
4, right?
In 6 games this year, I think 4 of the 6 that they've played, they've scored 30 or more points now.
Stupid numbers. And
It's
you know what? 108 yards passing.
you're still doing it the Hawkeye way, but
That's right.
I mean they dominate Washington 40-16, but it looks like Iowa really is something to be reckoned with. Now, I'm a little bit curious too. This week, and we could talk about it later, but Iowa comes to Spartan Stadium and takes on Michigan State. And look, Michigan State has some of its own questions it's still trying to answer, of course, but
They
nonetheless,
didn't lose last week.
that's right, coming off the bye. But I feel like teams have been able to own the trenches and look better against maybe some of those West Coast newcomers outside of Oregon.
Mhm.
They struggled a little bit with Iowa State. They lost that one 20-19. I kind of want to see, I think Michigan State can give us a sense too, a little bit of what exactly is Iowa. Like, I think there's a little bit of that in this game.
Yeah.
And if Iowa wins, and while you turn away for a second,
That's
if
all right.
Iowa
I
wins,
had to
it
clear
doesn't
my throat.
necessarily mean like they're on top of the world or anything, but I kind of want to see what the eye test. Okay, here's another Big Ten like defensive line. Are they
That's what I
still
was going to get
pushing
at.
them along? Yeah.
Michigan State can see a lot of how they perform. They could end up losing the game, but they could analyze that performance of the offense against that defense and just see how much progression they've made. This is one of those seasons, and I hate as a coach saying moral victories and stuff, but there are going to be a lot of those types of victories for Michigan State, even though they're losing the game. They may be winning some of them,
Mm-hmm.
but for the most part, it's them getting their footing and getting their quarterback ready to roll for the future.
Yep.
I
And the
truly
big
believe that.
Well, and I think the big thing too with Michigan State is, and look, there's been some injuries to it this year, but Michigan State's got to find a way to get the offensive line really beefed up. That way, the running game improves. That way, everything takes a tick up. But nonetheless, we digress. Wisconsin just beat the heck out of Rutgers, 42-7. That was a stunner. Looking at my
In
phone the other day.
Piscataway.
That was really hard to comprehend when I was like scrolling through scores.
Yeah, because not that we thought Rutgers was going to be a top tier team, but we thought they were going to, they were going to compete against some of those upper middle tier teams and maybe even the lower portions of the top tier teams. But that's 2 in a row for them, and it doesn't get a ton easier this week, I don't think. Oh, yeah, it does. Never mind. I won't talk about that. They played the number 17 team in the power rankings of the Big Ten. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. Wisconsin is such an anomaly because they win, they get up to 28-10 at the half against USC, and then they fold and lose by 10 or by 10 or whatever, and then they come out here and just thump the daylights out of Rutgers, and you're thinking maybe they only play a half at a time because they're up 14-0 at the half. Rutgers just didn't show up. Oh, you're muted or something. Your mic is not working. Dalton's talking to me, but he's not. I cannot hear him. Yeah, you're talking. I'm not hearing you. Nope. Okay, so as he works on that side, and he's frantically working, if you're just listening, to get his audio back on. But Wisconsin is just one of those teams that they're going to do some good things, and I just don't know who they are really. They've got a schedule that for the rest of the year they play Northwestern. They played Northwestern this week at Northwestern, then Penn State. You're muted still, so if it's working, your little microphone's muted. How about now? Nope, can't hear you. Wait, I just heard a little psst noise, so I don't know if maybe your connection isn't good to your mic. Oh,
Can you hear?
Yes.
Am I back? Okay, let's go. I had what happened. I'm so sorry, everybody. I don't think I even touched anything. Anyway, technology. Yeah.
So I was just talking about, I know you were listening at the same time while I was talking, but Wisconsin's got an interesting, they could play spoiler in a lot of different seasons here. And they've got Penn State in 2 weeks. Then they've got a week where they play Iowa, but then they host Oregon. And those two teams are vying for positions and maybe even a spot in the Big Ten championship game. And Wisconsin could play a part in there of ruining that for one of those two.
I agree. And Wisconsin now at 4 wins. Like you're talking bowl season of some shape and form. And maybe the question becomes, how good can that be? Like how good can you make your bowl game at the end? The other one from last week we want to touch on real quick. Northwestern absolutely housed the Maryland Terrapins 37-10. This was another one that you kind of, if you didn't watch it Friday night, you woke up Saturday and said, what happened in College Park?
Right. I made mention of this during the short that I did last week because we didn't have a full show. Is Maryland hosts Northwestern. I said it could be a decent game, but for the most part, I totally expected Maryland to not necessarily have an easy win, but relatively easy. And I look at it after my broadcast, and I'm like, what in the world is happening at College Park?
Well, and the big thing, of course, is Maryland ends up with 4 turnovers in this game.
Yeah,
You lose 3 fumbles, you have an interception. Northwestern had no turnovers. Like every football coach you'll hear every single week is, we got to play clean football,
yep.
no turnovers. A little bit of that is just kind of the truth of what happened in this game, but still seeing a 27-point differential between Northwestern and Maryland is still pretty staggering.
That's the
Um,
shocking part to me. Not that
yeah.
necessarily Illinois or Northwestern won, but that they won by 27.
Well, and here's the other thing that's pretty interesting. If you look at Northwestern, in the yards in this game,
Yep.
Northwestern throws for 203 yards, Maryland throws for 296. Uh, Northwestern runs for 80 yards, Maryland runs for 59. Neither team really did that much there. But in terms of yards, Maryland had 70 more yards than Northwestern,
And
and they
lost by
lost by
4 scores.
27. I
4
guess it's
scores.
just what?
Yeah, and it was, the headline to the recap is Northwestern exploits Maryland's turnovers. So they
Yeah,
were evidently rolling with a short field every time they turned them over, and were capitalizing on everything that they did. And good on Northwestern. They
yep,
now sit at 3-3 and 1-2 in the Big Ten. This was a game of winless in the Big Ten. So
yeah.
whoever won was getting their first win, but it just really surprised me that Northwestern won by 27. That's what
I
brought my eye to it.
I was the same with you on that. Let's go ahead and shift to this week and what's happening in Big Ten football. Friday night, Purdue hosts number 2 Oregon. Sam, if you're already shaking
I've
your
got a
head at me, but
broadcast, so I won't be able to watch it. Darn it.
or else you would be right.
I probably would be just so I could watch football,
But there's always some magic around Purdue and number 2. The
I know
Spoilermakers
that.
traditionally take down number 2,
And
but
they played really well last week.
this just feels like it has no juice to it. Like
About the
it
time you
is.
say that, here goes Purdue beating Oregon.
Well, but about the time I used to say it, there was a Rondale Moore running around, and they beat Iowa and Michigan
Mm-hmm.
State that were both number 2 at the time or whatever in 2021.
Yep.
I
That was a
I
great year.
I don't know what you look at, like, if you want to believe in the magic of the Spoilermakers, and I think a lot of people do just because it's fun. Um, but I don't know what there is there.
Well, the name lends to making Spoilermakers part of the actual, like what you call them. But yeah, I
I
don't
mean, I mean, in
know.
terms of on-field
Oh yeah,
productivity,
that
like,
I
yeah,
this year maybe the change to of quarterbacks for Purdue. I'm really shocked that Hudson Card has struggled the way he has, but Ryan Brown, he's a sophomore. He had 297 yards passing on against Illinois. If that's a good defense.
mhm,
I'm not saying that necessarily he's going to make the magic happen. I'm not saying that at all. But the fact that he kind of steps in and just starts throwing for almost 300 yards and they score 40 points in the second half, maybe that's something that gives them some sort of semblance of hope. I mean, you got to
yeah.
have hope no matter what, but legitimate hope of, what I'm saying is you always go out and expect to play your best game. Doesn't matter who you're playing, you expect to play your best game. And a lot of times when you're outmatched, it just doesn't happen. Maybe Purdue's got it going enough to compete for a half, or maybe shock the world and beat them by 1 point or whatever. Purdue would become Ohio State's favorite team after themselves if they beat Oregon this week.
That's probably a fair point, but yeah, I sometimes I can get into the groove of Purdue upsetting a top 2 team. I just don't see it
Oh,
this
I don't
time.
expect. I really the 27.5 point favorite or point spread for Oregon. I don't know that that's enough. I really don't.
Right.
I just don't.
Like,
Now the 61.5 over under, I might take the under, but I take Oregon at way more than 27.
yeah.
Like,
Okay.
yeah, I just don't think Purdue's going to put points on the board. I really don't. And
That's fair.
hopefully they shock the world or shock me on that and make it a competitive game.
Well, and therefore would also shock the world on that one.
Oh, for sure.
Um,
Yes, 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 absolutely.
there there are 2 Big Ten games this weekend that I think we need to focus and talk
Yeah.
about. There is a ranked matchup. Number 24 Michigan goes to number 22 Illinois. That's a 3:30 kick on Saturday. Illinois 5-1 on the season. We talked about all the ranked teams they've played. Their only loss comes to Penn State. Michigan looks to come off the bye week. They are currently 4-2. If we take a look at what they did before the bye week, they lost to Washington out in Seattle. They had defeated Minnesota, but you remember that had some controversy on the onside kick with it. They had the drive where they ran 8 out of 10 plays to beat USC at the end of the game. And of course, we saw the Texas game. So Michigan is a team that I don't think people are necessarily sold on, especially considering how one-dimensional they seem to be, where they just don't seem really capable of airing the ball out at all. Going against this Illinois team, I think this could be a wonderful matchup come Saturday.
I would consider Michigan to be very similar to what I think of USC, where they've got some good pieces. They will show signs of being just a spectacular team, but they're going to be kind of middle of the road this year. They're going to have a winning record, but they're going to be more like 8-4, 7-5, somewhere in that region. And and that's not saying that their reign is over. There's always going to be a downfall a little bit when you're at the peak, because that's when everybody leaves and goes and finds greener pastures or graduates or whatever. And so I think Michigan plays up to their competition a little bit, but necessarily doesn't always have what it takes to pull it out. I think this is a great matchup between the two, because you've got Michigan with a good running game still, and Illinois with a good defense. And I love that match. I love a good running team playing against a good defense, because then you really see how good their teams are. If one succeeds over the other, you're like, oh yeah, they've got the real deal then.
And I think if you still have any stock in Michigan, it's because of their defense. So I think you can believe in the defense.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious too, Sam, because you brought up the one side matchup, and I'm interested to see that. But also Luke Altmaier having the wonderful year he's had as Illinois
Threw for
quarterback
almost
so
400
far.
yards last week.
Yeah, like he's been tearing it up, hasn't been making mistakes, and he goes against one of the better defenses when you consider Mason Graham in the trenches, you consider Will Johnson at corner. Like that's going to be a fun matchup too. Ultimately, I think it's going to be a rather maybe low scoring type of game, but that should be a fun one to watch in Champaign.
It's not going to be 10-9, is it?
I don't think that low scoring.
17,
could be
14.
Maybe even a little bit more than that. I have to maybe recalibrate what low scoring is. But like
I was going to say, what is low scoring, because the over-under is 43.5.
Oh, wow. So Vegas really sees a low scoring. I was going to say something like 21-17 is kind of what I picture with this game. And we'll see kind of what happens from there, but that's going to be a fun one to watch. The other really good game that I'm interested in is at noon. Number 16 Indiana hosts Nebraska. Kurt Signetti and them boys 6-0, rolling here to start the season. Nebraska at 5-1 comes to town. We see you bobbing back and forth there, Sam. What are your thoughts on this one? Because, of course, you come from the Purdue perspective.
I hate it. I hate it because I truly think if IU wins this game, you've got to seriously consider them for the playoff. Not even just say, ooh, they're a dark horse. If they win against Nebraska, Nebraska's got a good team. They're still figuring things out. But IU should not be figuring things out and be this good. They just shouldn't be. But they are. And if they beat Nebraska with Dylan Raiola and I think you've really got to consider and say the dark horse. The Big Ten could put 4 in just because of how good IU is playing. That's. I don't know that they're going to beat both. Well, actually, I'm just going to go on the record. They're not going to beat both Michigan and Ohio State, but I think they're going to win one, especially if they win this week. And you froze on me. Oh, there you go. What you got? Anything? Can you see me? Hi.
Hello, Sam.
There you go. Can you not hear me?
Oh, no, I can hear you again. I'm sorry, we're having a connection issue.
Did you hear anything I just said?
I had you for a little bit, and then all of a sudden it started to... Oh, I heard like the first 10 seconds.
What was the last thing you heard?
I'm getting yelled at for not listening.
See, look at you. You're way delayed right now.
That Indiana needs to be seriously considered for the.
Okay. Well, I think it's you that is the problem. I'm not damning you. I'm just saying I think it is you that's the recording problem. But what I was gonna, I mentioned that I think if IU wins today or this week, they are definitely should be considered. But at the same time, I think they'll beat either Michigan or Ohio State. Wow, what a delay!
I lost you again. I am back.
Jeez.
I'll just keep it moving for our
I think IU's
listeners
going to beat Michigan or
because
Ohio State,
they're
one of the
probably
two.
experiencing something different than what I'm experiencing.
Did you get that?
I lost you again.
Anyways, let's move along. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll bring up a point and we can get you to react because I
Okay.
think you're having better action than what I am. But if we take a look at Indiana and Nebraska, I think if you look at Indiana and the way they're playing, they could beat Michigan or Ohio State.
He's saying exactly what I just said.
So partisan welcome. I just wanted to see if I can get you mad, but of course, with the connection issues, I couldn't even see your reaction. So that's awesome. But anyway, no, actually, what I would talk about is it with Indiana. Look, off to a 6-0 start. It's been incredible. They got to sell out their rock. I think that is amazing. When you all of a sudden within 6 games, they're talking about selling out games. They're selling out this one. They're selling out the Michigan game coming up later in the season. There's a real belief there with what the Hoosiers are doing. But also, I wanted to point to what Curtis Rourke is doing at quarterback has been exceptional for Indiana. And one of the big things is I saw the stat from Sports Illustrated for 1,750 yards. I want to say just about half of those, at like 830, are yards after catch. So this offense is putting guys in positions to make explosive plays. And that's a big part of the beauty of what's happening there in Bloomington.
I heard somebody ridicule him for not having most of those or a lot of those yards are yards after catch, and I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like you just said, they put him in the position to make the play. So what does it matter? That should go. He threw the ball, so therefore it should be a completion of that. So it just and you know what? For him to end up at IU, and I'm not saying that because I'm a Purdue fan, but for him to end up at IU kind of baffles me that not a bigger school tried to go after him because he's a really good quarterback. He really is.
Mhm. No, I agree. Well, and like, look, Tom Brady dinked and dunked his way to 7 Super Bowls for the most part. Like, it was a methodical way that he
Right.
handled and operated drives. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Putting playmakers in space and allowing them to make plays, that to me is your job as a quarterback.
Peyton
You don't
Manning
have
won a
to.
Super Bowl with that too. He dinked and dunked over against the Bears and in Miami, and they
Yep.
won the Super Bowl because of it. He took what he was given, and it shouldn't matter that he only threw 4-yard passes and ended up with 15 on the play. He took advantage of what he was given.
Yeah. And so you have Curtis Rourke on the one side, you have Dylan Raiola on the other side. This is going to be a fun matchup in terms of just quarterback play. Before you even dig into much else, Curtis Rourke now with 14 touchdowns, 2 picks on the year. Raiola with 9 tutties and 3 interceptions on the season.
Good
Look,
quarterback play on
ESPN,
both sides.
yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
ESPN's matchup predictor has Indiana favored at 76%, according to ESPN
Wow.
Analytics. Isn't that stunning?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because we were looking at the Nebraska schedule and saying they were going into Ohio State undefeated.
Yeah.
Now, granted, we didn't see Illinois being that good to where
Mhm.
they beat them. So we
And that was a
missed
winnable
that.
game for Nebraska. That was a
Sure.
winnable game.
Sure it was. But we wouldn't have thought that IU would have been the one
A
ranked 16
challenge.
in this matchup. If we would have said, okay, one of these two teams in the Nebraska IU game is going to be ranked 16, you're going to say, okay, Nebraska has done what they were supposed to.
And the other thing too is there's a lot of reason to be excited about this game, just point blank period, because it's a great matchup. But with Indiana, let's look at those 6 games, right? They beat FIU in the first game. They beat Western Illinois in the second game. They beat UCLA in the third game. They beat Charlotte in the fourth game. They beat Maryland in the fifth and Northwestern in the sixth. You could look at that and say, who's really of quality there? Now, the
Right.
reason everybody's been so impressed with Indiana and the reason why they're 16th is because they didn't just beat them, they beat the tar out of all 6 of those
77 to
teams.
3.
Yeah, like the FIU game, they win 31-7. They beat Western Illinois with a scoring school record of 77 points, to your point. They beat UCLA at their place by about 30. They beat Charlotte by 40. They beat Maryland by 2 scores. They beat Northwestern by 17. They haven't had a one-score game this season.
Their
And
closest game
that's,
is Maryland, and that's 2 touchdowns.
yeah, like, nobody I don't think really had maybe Indiana at a perfect 6-0 to start. Maybe some could have looked objectively and said 4-2,
I thought
5-1.
maybe Maryland would clip them.
Yeah, but the way that they have won these games is very un-Indiana like. Even when
Agreed.
Indiana's like been at its best, they normally don't dominate opponents like this. And so that's where it's like, oh, this is a whole new monster down there in Bloomington. So my point though is you come out of the Nebraska game against what is a quality opponent. And we're going to learn a little something about the Hoosiers and what to expect. And maybe we can calibrate our expectations for Indiana here for the back half of the schedule.
I'm not necessarily saying that the Nebraska game is the ceiling for IU.
Hmm.
I'm just saying that it is going to be a very profound measuring stick because Nebraska is going to be, the first team that they're actually playing.
Yep.
That is a legit bowl team. Now the others might be going to bowls, but they're not Nebraska this year. You know what I mean?
Correct.
They're not at all Nebraska. The schedule that they have is absolutely atrocious, and until you get to the last week, and even then though it's a rival game. So,
Hmm.
but Nebraska, then Washington. At least they host Washington, so that helps. They go to East Lansing, then they host Michigan, then they're at Columbus, and then they finish up hosting Purdue. That's not an easy schedule. They could easily lose 2 or 3 of those games, and we wouldn't be shocked. But honestly, I don't know that they do. They may go 4-2. They may go 5-1, just depending who they end up losing to in there. And if they do that, they're going to be in the playoff. I don't see how you could say they're not going to, because they will have a quality win, even if Michigan is unranked by the time they play them and they beat them. Let's say they beat them. They're still a quality win. They're still a top tier team in the Big Ten.
Who's got the controller in college football 25 where they took Indiana to the playoffs in year 1? That's the question I need to know with Kurt Signetti being the new head coach there at Indiana.
I just
As
spilled my coffee, so keep going.
I was gonna say, Kurt Signetti's cleaning things up like Sam is right now in his home office. But yeah, no, I mean it really is simply amazing. And when you take a look at Indiana, I mean, we talk about some of the things that they've been able to do on the field to change things around. But from an atmosphere standpoint, look, the vibes are completely different. Like, this is not your grandfather's Indiana team, unless your grandfather watched the 1967 Indiana football team. That's about as close as really you could come, because what they've done is just simply amazing at 6-0. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the Hoosiers as they take on Nebraska here this weekend. And what should be really an exhilarating game come here. And by the way, too, from the Nebraska side, look at 5-1. Nebraska's got some tough games left on their schedule. They still have to go to Columbus.
That's next week.
That is next week. Yes. Yeah. So Nebraska at 5-1, they go to Ohio State, then they host UCLA, then they go to USC, then they host Wisconsin, then they go to Iowa. There are still opportunities for Nebraska to maybe potentially finish with a 10-2 season, I think is really the ceiling for the Huskers, but that's still on the table technically. But it starts with this game. So that's what's going to be really interesting about this one. And who would have thought too, as we talked about Indiana's schedule down the stretch, Indiana, we're talking about that they could go 5-1 the final 6 games. Maybe they end up 4-2. Who knows? Maybe they even go 3-3.
That's still what I'm trying to think. Is it 3-3? That's still 9-3 for the season.
That's what I was gonna say. Who would have thought we'd be talking in October that the worst outcome that we could see for Indiana is 9-3?
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
that's insane. That's ridiculous.
And that's with
Um,
Michigan and Ohio State still on the schedule.
right. Like there's winnable games there for Indiana. I don't know if Ohio State is winnable for Indiana,
I
but
don't know
outside of
either.
that,
I think Michigan is.
I
I
think
really
so
do. I
too.
really think Michigan is a winnable game for IU.
I think just about everybody but Ohio State is a winnable game.
Agreed. I agree.
Yeah.
It's
So that'll be
definitely
interesting.
it's definitely. I accidentally when I spilled my coffee, I moved too far. Yeah, of all their games, I think the only one that I would say that I absolutely believe they will lose and won't change is November 23rd when they play Ohio State
Yeah.
in Columbus. I think that's the only one that I absolutely say, yes, they're going to lose. Now, could
Let's
they lose some other ones? Yeah, they could.
let's get a top 10 matchup in Columbus between Indiana and Ohio State.
How
That would be electric.
how amazingly absurd would that be when you're
That's
when you're
great.
considering it when you know what was it back in the COVID year when Michael Penix Jr. took
Yep.
the Hoosiers into Columbus, that it wasn't a top 10 but it was a highly you know touted matchup that year, and Ohio State just absolutely housed them. I think they scored 24 points in I know it was 3 touchdowns in like 2 minutes of game time.
Yeah.
It was absurd.
Something ridiculous. But I tell you what, I think Sam is just about done cleaning things up over
Yeah,
there. We're
how'd
going to
you
ask him to
know?
clean up the show too, and let everybody know where they can find us on the podcast if
Give me
they
1
don't know.
second here. Okay. All right. You had slow technical difficulties. I had stupid
Did.
Sam moment difficulties. So, you can grant me a couple of seconds there. No, on the TikToks, the Instagrams, and the platform formerly known as Twitter, we are at B1G_talk. That's B1G Dalton, not BIG. You are number one. And on Facebook, go to BIG Talk, Big Talk, not all Big Talk. Those are great people over there, but they're not us. So then every week on Friday morning, you will find our live stream on ASAP Network. Then later that day or the day after that, depending on how much time I've got, you will find the podcast version through Lounge Media Group and the Lounge Sports Network. Anywhere you find your podcasts. But if you need to watch the stream because you missed it and just have to see Dalton's big face right now against the camera, then
How close I could get before there was a comment.
because I was looking down, right? If you will need to see the stream, just go ahead and come to Spotify, and you can watch the recording of our webcast, videocast, whatever kind of cast you want to call it, there on Spotify.
Awesome. Well, that'll do it for another episode of Big Talk, college sports with a Midwest perspective, blue collar and blue blood. For my partner, Sam Sprunger, I'm Dalton Shetler. Thank you all so much, and have a great weekend, everybody.
See you later.